My name is Elise Warren. I am 33, and the night before my sister's wedding, I thought I was simply dropping off a gift. I smiled, made a small joke about tomorrow, and in that instant the room changed. My uncle's face drained of color, my aunt would not meet my eyes, and a silence heavier than words settled around us. I did not know yet what they were hiding, but I could feel it pressing closer with every breath. What secret could turn joy into dread, and why was I the only one left in the dark? The late afternoon sun in Evanston spilled through the lace curtains of Aunt Maxine's living room, throwing soft patterns across the carpet. I shifted the crystal frame in my arms, careful not to smudge the glass. It was my gift for Clara and Mark, something elegant for their new life together. I told myself the choice meant something, that it showed I belonged. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and brewed coffee, familiar and comforting, yet today it made me strangely tense. Uncle Robert sat in his armchair, a half-empty cup on the side table. He looked up with his usual gentle smile as I stepped in, but I noticed the way his eyes flicked to the package in my arms and then back to my face, almost guilty. I forced brightness into my voice. I had spent weeks preparing for this day, practicing what I would say, hoping the celebration would be a step toward mending all the cracks in this family. So I grinned, walked across the room, and said lightly, "Can't wait for tomorrow, Uncle Robert." The words seemed to hang in the air far longer than they should. His smile faltered. His hand froze around the handle of his cup, and he slowly set it down with a faint clink. For a moment his mouth opened, then closed again. His eyes, usually steady and kind, darted toward Aunt Maxine, who was folding napkins at the dining table. "Elise," he said, finally, his voice hushed, "are you sure it's tomorrow?" The breath caught in my chest. My fingers tightened around the wrapped gift until the corners pressed sharp against my palm. I let out a confused laugh, too high, too thin. "Of course it's tomorrow. The invitation is sitting right in my purse." June 15th, written in golden script. Maxine's hands stilled on the napkins. She pressed her lips together and looked down, her shoulders sagging. When she finally raised her face, her eyes were glassy-rimmed red, as if she had been crying earlier. She did not say anything. She did not need to. A chill spread through me, though the room was warm. I set the package gently on the coffee table, my movements slow, deliberate, as if rushing might break whatever fragile reality I was standing on. I glanced at Robert, then back at Maxine. Neither met my eyes. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong all along, and I had been too eager, too desperate for inclusion to notice the signs. My pulse hammered in my ears, and for a moment the walls of the room seemed to tilt. I shifted to steady myself, and that was when I saw it. The large leather-bound album on the table, partly hidden beneath a stack of mail and a folded tablecloth. Its glossy cover reflected the fading light. Without thinking, I reached for it, pulled it free, and opened the first page. The air left my lungs. There was Clara, my older sister, beaming in a lace gown, Mark at her side in a tailored navy suit. White chairs arranged neatly on a manicured lawn, guests applauding, my mother's pearls glinting at her throat as she smiled for the camera. Date stamped discreetly in the corner, June 8, 2024. My vision blurred, not from tears but from the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. I turned another page, then another, each one confirming the same truth. The flowers already wilted, the vows already spoken, the toasts already made. Clara and Mark were already married. The invitation in my purse had not been a mistake. It had been a lie. The crystal frame slipped from my grip. The crash echoed through the quiet room, shards scattering across the hardwood, catching the last streaks of sunlight. The sound felt final, like a door closing behind me. I looked up, the album heavy in my lap, my aunt's face turned away, my uncle's eyes full of something I could not bear to name. The room smelled of lemon polish and coffee, but all I could taste was betrayal. I pressed my hand against the open page, where Clara's smile shone radiant and whole. The page was glossy smooth beneath my trembling fingers, as if nothing in the picture could be touched or changed. Tomorrow no longer existed. It had been stolen from me before I even knew it was mine to lose. I closed the album slowly, the sound of the cover shutting as heavy as the weight in my chest, and sat back in silence while the light faded around us. My hands felt stiff, as if the album had frozen my fingers in place. I pushed it away and reached for my purse, needing proof that I was not losing my mind. My breath came shallow-clipped as I dug through receipts and a half-used lipstick until my hand closed around the thick cream envelope. The golden script still gleamed under the lamplight, my name curling across the front as if it carried love instead of cruelty. I pulled out the card, my eyes locking on the date that had given me weeks of hope. June 15, 2024. The calligraphy was elegant, deliberate, and there was no mistake. My lips moved silently over the words, as if repeating them could rewrite reality. Behind me, Robert shifted in his chair. His voice was so low I almost missed it. They did not want you there. The words fell like stones into the silence. For a second, I could not breathe. My chest constricted, my pulse beating fast and erratic. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me I had misunderstood, that it had been some bizarre clerical error. But he only sat there, his eyes tired, his shoulders bent as if the weight of the truth had been pressing down on him for far too long. The wrapped frame slid from the edge of the table where I had set it down. It hit the hardwood with a shattering crack, glass spraying like ice across the floor. I flinched at the sound, a sharp echo of everything breaking inside me. The fragments caught the light, glittering mockingly like tiny mirrors, reflecting back a version of me I no longer recognized. I remembered the day the envelope first arrived. It was late April, a bright morning, the air still cool but carrying the scent of budding lilacs. I had walked back from the mailbox with the sun warm on my shoulders. My fingers had trembled as I traced the raised lettering. Elise Warren, embossed in gold. For a moment, I stood on the front steps, clutching that invitation to my chest like it was a gift from heaven itself. I thought this was the sign, the proof that maybe finally they wanted me there. That maybe Clara had grown past her bitterness and our mother past her constant dismissals. I spent hours that night at my kitchen table, the invitation propped against a vase, staring at it as if it might vanish. My chest had felt light in a way it had not in years, as if someone had lifted a stone I did not know I carried. Now, with the album heavy in my lap and the broken glass at my feet, that same invitation felt like an elaborate trap. Maxine crossed the room and knelt down, carefully gathering shards of crystal in her frail hands. Her bracelets clinked softly as she worked, her eyes averted. I crouched beside her, my movements jerky, the sharp edges catching the skin of my fingertips. "Let me," I whispered, my voice steadier than I felt. We gathered the pieces in silence. Every splinter of glass felt like a splinter of trust, impossible to put back together. When I finally sat back on my heels, Robert still had not moved. He looked older than I remembered, the lines around his mouth deepening as if he had aged years in minutes. So this was it. Not a mistake. Not an oversight. They had carved me out of Clara's life the same way they had carved me out of every holiday photo, every conversation where I was only mentioned in passing, every family dinner where my seat was filled with someone else's importance. The air in the room pressed against me, thick with the unspoken. My heart pounded against my ribs, my palms damp, my head spinning. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tear the invitation into shreds and throw it into the fire. But my voice would not rise. Instead, it came out quiet, flat, almost detached. "Why?" Robert closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they shone with something like guilt or pity, I could not tell which. "It was easier this way," he said, words barely audible. "That was what they told us. Easier." The words seared through me. Easier to erase me than to let me sit quietly in the back row. Easier to pretend I did not exist than to risk the possibility of discomfort. The walls of the room seemed to close in. I pressed my hands into my knees to ground myself, to keep from falling. I looked again at the invitation still lying open on the table. The golden calligraphy mocked me, the promise of belonging that was never real. The edges dug into my fingers as I held it tight enough to crumple. Through the window, the street lamps flickered on, casting their glow over the quiet suburban street. Inside, the house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Time moved forward, steady and unbothered, while everything inside me splintered. The album lay closed, but its images burned behind my eyes. The truth was no longer hidden. It was printed on glossy paper, stamped with a date, and displayed in front of me with pride. There was no mistake. The invitation had been written with intention. The exclusion had been chosen. I sat there in the dimming light, the invitation heavy in my hand, the shards of glass still glittering on the floor, and felt something shift deep inside me. A fracture, yes, but also a beginning. 2 months earlier, I had sat at the long oak dining table in my parents' Evanston home, the smell of roasted chicken and garlic bread filling the air. The chandelier threw soft light across polished silverware, and for once I had arrived hoping the evening would be civil. Clara cleared her throat, her hand slipping into Mark Dalton's, and the table hushed as if on cue. I watched my sister rise, her eyes shining with the practiced glow she had always known how to summon. Mark, tall and composed in a tailored gray jacket, looked at her with quiet pride. Clara's voice carried easily across the room. She announced their engagement and lifted her hand so the diamond ring could catch the light. Applause erupted around me. My mother Margaret gasped dramatically, her hand covering her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. She stood quickly, wrapping Clara in a fierce embrace, repeating how proud she was, how long she had prayed for this moment. My father Richard raised his glass of wine, his smile wide, his nod approving. The cousins at the far end clapped loudly, their voices overlapping in congratulations. I forced my lips into a smile that felt more like a grimace. The words came out stiff, brittle at the edges. "Congratulations, Clara." I heard my own voice and almost did not recognize it. My sister's eyes skimmed over me without landing, moving past me as if I were no more significant than the wallpaper. The cheer at the table swelled again, covering the silence that fell around my place. The evening blurred into a series of moments where I tried to laugh at jokes that did not include me, to nod at stories that circled around me. Clara glowed in the center, reliving the proposal on Navy Pier, telling the story of how Mark had reserved a private spot and surprised her with champagne. Everyone leaned closer, hanging on her words. I kept my hands folded in my lap, the muscles in my jaw tight from holding my smile. Later that night, I excused myself early, claiming work the next morning. Outside, the air was sharp with early spring. I drove back to Chicago with the radio off, the silence pressing against my ears. But even then, under the sting of exclusion, I carried a tiny ember of hope. The invitation would come, I told myself. This time would be different. A week later, I found myself on Michigan Avenue, standing before a three-way mirror in a boutique store. I had chosen a dress in a soft slate blue, elegant but not loud, the kind of dress that whispered I belonged without demanding to be noticed. The saleswoman adjusted the fabric on my shoulder and smiled warmly. "You look radiant," she said. "Big family wedding," I laughed, softly embarrassed but proud. "Yes. My sister is getting married." The words tasted sweet, then full of possibility. I imagined myself sitting at the ceremony, not in the shadows, but as part of the whole, clapping as Clara walked down the aisle. I imagined catching my mother's eye and seeing not disapproval but acknowledgement. I paid for the dress and carried the bag home as if it held not fabric but a new chance. In the evenings, I practiced what I might say to Mark. I wanted him to know I was genuinely happy for them, that despite years of distance, I was trying. I rehearsed jokes that sounded light but not forced, compliments that felt sincere. It was silly maybe, but I thought if I prepared enough I could slip into the family fold without friction. Now, sitting in Aunt Maxine's living room with broken glass at my feet and the album's glossy pages still seared into my vision, that memory stung like salt. The dress still hung untouched in my closet, a relic of foolishness. How could I have been so naive? I replayed the way Clara's gaze had skimmed over me that night, the way my mother had poured all her joy into Clara's embrace as if no one else in the room existed. The signs had been clear. I had chosen not to see them. Anger bubbled up hot and fast, not just at them but at myself. I had believed the golden script on an envelope could erase decades of dismissal. I had let myself imagine belonging when every instinct warned me otherwise. The light in the living room dimmed further, and I pressed the invitation flat against my thigh, the paper bending under my grip. A bitter laugh escaped me, low and humorless. I thought of the saleswoman's smile, of her saying I looked radiant, as if she had glimpsed a future that never was. I leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling where the shadows lengthened. I had carried that hope like a fragile flame, and tonight it had been snuffed out with deliberate cruelty. The memory of that dinner, of the boutique mirror, of my own glowing reflection tightened in my chest until I could hardly breathe. I pressed my palm flat against my ribs, trying to hold myself steady. In that silence, I knew one thing with clarity. I had been too forgiving, too willing to believe in scraps of affection. I would not make that mistake again. The invitation slid from my lap and landed on the table beside the closed album. I did not reach for it. I let it sit there mocking me while the house settled into quiet around me. The next evening I drove to my parents' Tudor home in Evanston, the one with the ivy climbing across brick walls and the curved wooden door that had loomed over my childhood. The summer air was heavy with the scent of cut grass, and the windows glowed with warm light that spilled across the lawn. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment staring at the familiar facade, my fingers drumming against the steering wheel. My heart pounded with a mixture of dread and fury, but I forced myself out of the car and walked up the stone path. Inside, the sound of laughter carried from the living room. I paused in the foyer, the cool tile beneath my shoes grounding me as I listened. When I stepped into the room, they were all there, clustered together around the coffee table. My mother Margaret perched at the edge of the sofa, her hand resting tenderly on Clara's shoulder. My father Richard leaned back in his armchair, a cigar resting in the ashtray beside him, pride written across his face. Clara herself sat in the center, her head tilted toward Mark, who had his arm around her with easy confidence. The cousins leaned over the album spread open before them, the glossy photos reflecting the lamplight. The sound of my footsteps drew their eyes. For a moment, the room froze, as if a scene from a photograph had been interrupted. I felt the weight of their stares press against me. I spoke before any of them could open their mouths. The words came out sharp, cutting through the silence. The wedding was last week. You sent me the wrong date. Clara closed the album slowly, her lips curving into a smile that held no warmth. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as if she were amused by my confusion. I needed one perfect day, Elise. One day without you making everything about yourself. The words landed like a slap. My chest tightened, but I refused to let her see me falter. I turned my gaze to my mother. So you went along with this, you let them shut me out. Margaret's face softened in a way that only made her cruelty sharper. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, as if she were explaining something to a child. Families need peace, Elise. Your presence brings tension. We couldn't allow that on Clara's special day. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. Peace? You mean pretending I don't exist? Richard cleared his throat, his voice steady but cold. You always bring drama, Elise. We wanted a celebration, not conflict. The fury inside me flared hot. My hands shook as I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. I snapped it open, scattering receipts and invoices across the coffee table. The glossy pages of the album were buried under papers stamped with numbers and signatures. Do you see these? My voice rose as I jabbed a finger at the top sheet. $250,000 in repairs. Roof foundation, dock reinforcement. Paid in full. Without me, the lake house would have collapsed years ago. The room went still. Margaret's hand slipped from Clara's shoulder, her eyes flickering toward the documents as if they burned. Richard's cigar smoldered forgotten in the ashtray. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. Clara scoffed, her tone dismissive. That doesn't give you the right to ruin everything. Ruin everything. My laugh cracked into a shout. Without me, that place would have been lost. Without me, your summers by the lake, your perfect parties, your cherished family gatherings would have never happened. I saved it. I kept it alive while you all pretended it was yours. My voice echoed against the high ceiling, the intensity vibrating through my chest. For a moment, no one spoke. Their silence was an answer more damning than words. Margaret finally broke it, her tone brittle. That house is part of our family. You only complicated things by involving your company. I snapped my head toward her. Complicated things? Brightline Holdings paid for every beam and nail. I made sure it stood when no one else lifted a hand. And you dare call me a complication? Richard rose slowly from his chair, his shoulders squared, but his eyes avoided mine. This is not the time, Elise. It will never be the time for you, will it? My voice trembled with rage. You'll never acknowledge what I've done. You'll never admit how much you've taken. Clara leaned back her arms, crossed a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. Always playing the victim. That's who you are, Elise. Something inside me snapped, then sharp and final. I slammed my palm against the stack of papers, the sound cracking like a whip through the room. Without me, that house would have been gone. Without me, you wouldn't have had your precious backdrop for family photographs. Don't you dare call me the problem. The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. My chest heaved as I stared at their faces, each one unwilling to meet my eyes. The album lay half buried under receipts, the perfect smiles of Clara and Mark hidden beneath the record of my sacrifices. I stood there, the fury still pulsing through me, and waited for someone, anyone, to speak. The room felt brittle, as if the air itself might crack if I moved too quickly. I could see my mother's eyes dart from my face to Clara's, then back to the polished wood of the dining table where the photo album still lay. My father rubbed his temple, the lines across his forehead deepening with every passing second. I knew if I didn't press forward now, the silence would swallow everything I had carried here tonight. So I reached into my bag and pulled out a leather folder I had been holding onto for years. It was slim but weighty in a way only official papers could be. I placed it carefully on the table, the sound of it landing soft but final, and flipped it open so the golden lamplight spilled across the first page. The notary seal gleamed in the corner like a scar. This is not about feelings or family arguments. This is about facts. I slid the contract forward with the edge of my hand. Both of you signed this in August 2020. That summer you transferred the lake house to Brightline Holdings, my company. Not as a placeholder, not as a formality. A sale. My mother leaned forward, her breath quick and shallow, scanning the familiar strokes of her own signature. Her lips parted and then closed again. Finally, she whispered, her voice rising with every word that was just supposed to be temporary. You were only supposed to hold it for us. I straightened my back and looked her in the eye. It is notarized. It is legally binding. You both signed in front of a witness. This is not temporary, it is ownership. Mine. Clara gave a sharp laugh, but it sounded more like glass splintering than amusement. You can't be serious. Everyone knows that house has always been ours. My chest tightened. I turned to her, remembering the night 4 years earlier when she had shown up at my apartment unannounced. You came to me, Clara. You begged me to help you. Do you remember that night? Your hands were shaking so badly you could barely hold the pen. You told me you needed someone to cover emergency expenses. You promised it was just a loan, that you would fix it later, and I foolishly believed you. Margaret's cheeks flushed crimson. That was different, she snapped, her voice trembling. We were desperate. We had no choice. I raised my voice, the anger clawing its way out of me. No, I had no choice. You had already maxed out your credit cards. Dad's retirement savings were gone. The bank was about to foreclose. Without me stepping in, you would have lost the house completely. I tapped the page with my finger hard enough that the table rattled. This is the truth. Not a story you can twist, not a memory you can blur. I own it. And you have known that every single day since you signed. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My father's hand shook as he set his glass down on the table, the ice cubes clinking against the crystal. He didn't look at me, but his silence told me more than words could. He knew. He had always known. The heat in my chest shifted into something heavier, something that settled into my bones. For years I had swallowed my doubts, convinced myself I was imagining the way they erased my efforts, diminished my sacrifices. Tonight, the evidence sat between us, undeniable. Clara's lips curled into a smirk, though her eyes betrayed the flicker of unease. You're making this uglier than it needs to be. I shook my head, my voice low but steady. I don't have to make it ugly. The signatures are right here. Your debt is right here. My company carried the burden while you pretended everything was fine. The weight of memory pulled me back to that night in 2020. Clara had arrived at my door drenched from the storm outside, mascara streaking down her cheeks, whispering that her life was collapsing. She said she needed me. She said family was supposed to step up for family. And I, naive enough to believe, signed the papers that let her escape the mountain of debt. I remembered the smell of rain on her coat, the way her voice cracked when she thanked me. A performance I realized now rehearsed and perfect. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the papers, then drew back without touching them. Her voice was barely audible. We thought it would stay in the family. The bitterness in my throat burned. It did. I am family whether you want me here or not. No one spoke. The walls seemed to press inward, the lamplight flickering over their faces, pale and strained. My father's shoulders slumped as he stared down at the table, his jaw clenched. For a brief moment, I saw the man he had been years ago, strong and decisive. Now he sat hollowed out by secrets, unwilling to stand for the truth. The silence stretched on, heavy and unyielding. I folded my arms and leaned back, letting the contract remain open in the center of the table like a mirror they could not look away from. This was the moment I had been carrying toward for years without even realizing it. Every favor asked of me, every slight disguised as a joke, every sacrifice dismissed as if it meant nothing. It had all led here, to this room, to this confrontation. I drew in a slow breath, feeling the anger that had fueled me soften into something sharper, colder, more dangerous. They wanted to erase me. Instead, I had given them the one thing they could never erase: proof. The folder stayed on the table, pages glowing under the yellow light, while the house settled into silence again. I let it sit there, not rushing to close it, not eager to fill the silence. I wanted them to look at it, to sit with what they had done, with the choices they had made. And I waited, the fury inside me, now steady, controlled, certain for someone to finally break the silence. That night, I lay awake in my apartment in downtown Chicago, the city lights spilling through the glass walls and painting restless patterns across my ceiling. Sleep was nowhere near me. I had pulled out the old shoebox from my closet, the one I rarely touched, and spread its contents across my bed. Photographs curled at the edges from years of handling family, smiles frozen in moments that now felt like another lifetime. There was one of Clara and me on a swing set in Evanston, our hair tangled by the wind, our grins wide and unguarded. Another of Dad standing by the lake house grill with an apron around his waist, smoke rising in the background while Mom held a tray of lemonade. I traced the outline of those images with my fingertips, the paper cool beneath my hands, and wondered how those faces had turned into strangers across the dinner table. A lump rose in my throat, so thick it ached. For a moment, I almost reached for my phone. My mother's number glowed at the top of my contacts. My thumb hovered, the thought flashing through my mind like lightning. I could call her. I could say I was sorry for shouting. I could pretend we were still salvageable. But the phone remained dark. Deep inside, I knew what her response would be. She would sigh, say that I had always been dramatic, that family required compromise, that my place was to smooth things over while Clara shone. My heart clenched at the thought. I set the phone face down and pushed it away. I rolled over and pulled my laptop onto my knees. If I could not rest, I could at least count. Numbers, unlike people, did not lie. I opened a spreadsheet I had been building quietly for years. My fingers flew across the keyboard, filling in line after line until the screen glowed with rows of figures. $250,000 for lake house renovations in 2020. Another $75,000 for property taxes when Dad said the bills had slipped through the cracks. $55,000 to cover Clara's failed restaurant lease in Wicker Park. And the quiet deposits I had made every Christmas to keep their mortgage current, small enough not to draw attention but enough to add up over a decade. By the time I was finished, the total reached nearly $400,000. I stared at the number until the digits blurred. For years I had told myself it was love, that sacrifice was what family asked of you. I had worked 12-hour days at Brightline Holdings, missing birthdays, skipping vacations, clawing my way up so that I could provide for them. Each payment had felt like insurance that one day they would see me not as an afterthought but as someone who belonged at the table. The glow of the screen lit my face, harsh and unforgiving. My reflection stared back at me in the glass eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, hair falling in waves around my shoulders. I whispered into the quiet apartment barely loud enough to hear myself. This is not sacrifice anymore. This is evidence. The words sank deep, heavy, and solid. Evidence meant I was not crazy. Evidence meant I had something tangible when their voices rose to tell me I imagined it all. Evidence meant power. I closed my eyes, but the pictures still pressed against my skin from the bedspread. Clara's face when she announced her engagement. Mom's embrace around her shoulders. Dad's quiet toast while my own name had never been spoken. Every memory felt sharpened now, the edges cutting me with every breath. I pushed the photos aside, carefully stacking them back into their box. They would not lull me into sentiment tonight. I had learned better. The past was not a comfort, it was a warning. By the time I shut the laptop, the city had shifted into early dawn. The first glow of morning painted the skyline in muted gold, the L trains humming in the distance. My eyes burned, but my resolve was clear. I set the shoebox back in the closet, closed the door firmly, and drew a long breath. There was no erasing what had been done. No rewriting the invitations, no pretending the signatures on those contracts were less real because they were inconvenient. I had evidence, and for the first time I understood its weight. I leaned against the cool glass of the window, watching the city wake below, and whispered to myself that from now on I would not beg for a place at their table. From now on I would build my own. The words steadied me, not like comfort but like steel cooling into form. The apartment around me was still, the only sound the distant hum of Chicago beginning another day. I stepped away from the window, let the laptop screen go black, and stood in the silence of my home. This was no longer the quiet of loneliness. It was the quiet before action. The next afternoon, the glass walls of my office in the Loop reflected the midday sun, the city spread out beneath me in restless motion. I had tried to lose myself in emails and quarterly reports, but my mind refused to stay anchored. A soft knock came at the door, and when I looked up, Aunt Maxine stood there clutching a canvas tote against her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes darting down the hallway as though she had smuggled something dangerous into the building. She slipped inside quickly and shut the door behind her. For a moment she only held the tote tighter, her knuckles white. I rose from behind my desk and asked if she was all right. She nodded, though the gesture was unconvincing, and placed the bag on the edge of my desk with care as if it might shatter. Inside were manila folders, the kind you bought in bulk at office supply stores. She whispered that she had found them when she was helping Robert clear out the attic. I pulled the first folder open and froze. Printed emails. Screenshots of text messages. Notes scribbled in my mother's handwriting. At the top, Clara's name appeared again and again. Their words were unmistakable. Clara explaining how I would cover property taxes if pressed correctly. Mom writing back that I could be persuaded with guilt, that all it would take was a pointed comment about family duty. Clara joking about how I never asked for anything in return, how predictable it was that I would always step in. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of my desk, bile rising at the back of my throat. Maxine murmured that she had not known. She said she suspected things were unfair, but not this. Not a plan, not written evidence. I could barely breathe. My voice was raw when I asked why she was giving this to me. She answered simply that truth deserved to be seen. Before I could respond, a new voice broke the silence. Jenna Morales, my attorney, stepped into the room. I had called her earlier that morning, restless and unable to quiet my racing thoughts. She was sharp-eyed, her navy suit crisp, her manner calm but decisive. I gestured toward the folders without explanation. She sat, spread the papers across the desk, and began to read. The seconds stretched as her eyes moved line by line. When she finally leaned back, she exhaled through her nose, steady and sure. What you have here is financial abuse, Elise. Clear as day. The words hit me with equal parts relief and grief. For so long I had doubted myself, convinced that my exhaustion was weakness, that my resentment was ungratefulness. Hearing Jenna say it aloud untangled something inside me. It was not imagination. It was not paranoia. It was documented exploitation. My hands trembled as I signed the authorization she slid across the desk. With one signature, I gave her permission to gather the records formally to prepare filings that would strip away the secrecy my family had cloaked themselves in. My pen scratched against the page steady despite the storm raging inside me. Maxine reached across the desk, her fingers brushing mine. I could see tears welling in her eyes. She whispered that she was sorry that she should have done more years ago. I told her quietly that it was not too late. Jenna closed the folder with finality and said the next step was simple but crucial. Cut off all financial assistance immediately. No more checks, no more quiet transfers, no more covering for their mistakes. She said it with the authority of someone who had seen patterns like mine before. The cycle only ended when the support ended. The truth of it sank deep. I opened my phone and scrolled through my banking app. One by one, I canceled the recurring payments, the small deposits that had become second nature. I stared at the screen as I hit confirm, my chest tightening with something that felt like freedom laced with fear. When it was done, I set the phone down. The room was quiet again, but not empty. There was a presence in the silence now, the weight of choice and consequence. Maxine dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, whispering that Clara would be furious. I almost laughed, the sound bitter and strange in my throat. Furious was fine. Furious meant she would finally feel something other than entitlement. I leaned back in my chair, the city's noise faint through the glass. For the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me solid and unyielding. I was not begging anymore. I was not waiting for recognition that would never come. Jenna gathered the papers into neat stacks, her voice calm as she outlined what would happen next. Depositions. Formal requests. Discovery. Words that sounded clinical but carried the promise of sunlight breaking into shadows. I nodded, absorbing it all, though a part of me was still standing in that childhood photograph with Clara on the swing set. Only now the ropes were fraying, the wood splintering. The innocence had long since fallen away. When Maxine left, she squeezed my hand tight, her whisper firm. "You are not alone in this." I held onto that as she walked out. I stayed seated long after both women were gone, staring at the Chicago skyline. The papers were stacked neatly in front of me, the signature ink still drying. My fingers brushed over the top folder, and for the first time I did not feel powerless. The city buzzed on, unaware that a fracture inside me had settled into something else entirely. I exhaled slowly, steady and deliberate, letting the moment anchor me. This was not the end. It was the point where everything began to turn. 3 weeks later, I was back in my office on Monroe Street, the sky outside heavy with summer rain, when my receptionist buzzed to say Pastor Williams was here with my parents. I felt the air tighten before I even opened the door. Pastor Williams had baptized Clara and me when we were girls, had preached about forgiveness every Sunday we sat in the second pew. He entered first, carrying that calm presence I had once trusted, with my mother and father just behind him. Margaret's lips were pinched. Richard's gaze slid away from mine. They took the seats opposite my desk without waiting for an invitation. Pastor Williams folded his hands in his lap, his voice warm but careful. "Elise," he said, "your parents are worried. This anger, this fight in the courts, it is pulling your family apart. God calls us to forgiveness." I listened in silence. My mother nodded beside him, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes, though her expression was hard. Richard shifted his jaw tight but said nothing. "Forgiveness," I repeated softly. I reached into my drawer and pulled out 2 invitations. One was the card I had received in the mail, neat calligraphy spelling the 15th of June. The other I had gotten later, the real one, pried from the truth like a splinter. It said the 8th of June. I laid them flat on the desk between us. My voice did not tremble. "Is this what forgiveness looks like? Sending your daughter a false invitation so she walks into an empty church? Watching her bring a gift to a wedding that already happened? Was I supposed to forgive the laughter behind closed doors when they knew I would show up to nothing?" Pastor Williams leaned forward, concern etched into his features. He said perhaps mistakes had been made, but that family bonds were greater than paper or dates. My mother's breath hitched as if she wanted to agree, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, the way she did not deny it. I tapped the invitations with my finger. "Mistakes are when you forget to sign a card or show up late to dinner." This was deliberate. Clara wanted me gone. And you all let her. The silence that followed was heavy. Rain tapped against the glass, steady and relentless. Pastor Williams tried again. Elise, bitterness only poisons the one who carries it. I want you to consider letting go. Letting go, I said. I leaned back, folded my arms, and studied their faces. I have let go every year of my life. I let go when I paid the tax bill so the lake house would not be seized. I let go when Clara's restaurant collapsed, and I covered her debt so she would not drown. I let go every time you looked past me because she cried louder. I am done letting go. My father closed his eyes briefly, shoulders sinking. For the first time I saw shame flicker there, though it was buried deep under years of silence. Pastor Williams shook his head slowly. Elise, what do you want? What do I want? I repeated. I want recognition of what you all did. And I want release. From now on, I owe nothing to this family. Not money, not loyalty, not silence. My mother gasped, her hand pressed to her chest. You cannot say that. But I could, and I did. I said it again, louder this time, the words steady. I cut the duty of being your daughter. From today, I owe you nothing. The room chilled as the words hung in the air. Pastor Williams looked at me with sadness, but said nothing more. He gathered his coat, his voice low as he said he would pray for me. Margaret stood stiffly, anger simmering beneath her tears. Richard lingered a moment, eyes on the floor, then turned and followed them out. When the door closed, I sank into my chair, heart hammering. My palms were damp, but my chest felt strangely light. The fallout began quickly. Within days, my cousin Rebecca, who had always been one of Clara's closest allies, called me. She said she had heard about the 2 invitations. She asked quietly if it was true. When I confirmed, her silence stretched long, then she exhaled hard. She told me she would not be attending Clara's next dinner. That she was finished with the games. Others followed. Friends from the church who had known us since childhood began to step back from Clara's orbit. Declined her invitations politely but firmly. The whispers spread. Some said they did not want to be caught in the middle, but others admitted outright they were disgusted. I watched it unfold, not with triumph, but with a strange detachment. It was not my doing, not really. It was the truth finally allowed to breathe in public. Each night I returned to my apartment overlooking the river, and each night I felt a little less burdened. There was sorrow, yes, but it no longer consumed me. What I felt now was resolve. The rain finally broke that weekend. The city washed clean, the air sharp with the smell of wet pavement. I stood by my window looking out at the skyline and whispered the words again. I owe them nothing. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. By August, the heat in Chicago pressed down heavy, the kind that made the air in the loop shimmer as if the glass towers themselves were wavering. I pushed open the door to Jenna Morales' office and felt the blessed cool air rush over me. She was already waiting at the long oak table, files stacked neatly, a pitcher of water sweating in the center. Beside her sat Thomas Bedford, a steady presence in a tailored suit, his glasses catching the light. Thomas had been my financial advisor for years, one of the few I trusted without question. He greeted me with a firm nod and slid a folder across the table. Elise, he said, this closes every joint account, every cosign obligation. Your name is clear from anything tied to them. He tapped his pen on the papers. They cannot reach you anymore through banks or credit. I signed each line slowly, the scratch of my pen sounding louder than it should. With each signature, something inside me unlatched. I remembered every late-night transfer, every emergency bill I covered without hesitation, believing family was worth it. Now the final cord was cut. Jenna leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the documents as I finished. Good. That wall is in place, she said. But there is more. She opened a different file, thicker, the edges worn from handling. My stomach tensed. She pulled out statements and copies of applications. Elise, she said carefully, did you authorize an $80,000 credit line with Fidelity Capital in April? I stared at her, confused. Number. Absolutely not. Jenna turned the paper toward me. There was my name printed cleanly across the top, my social security number, my signature scrawled at the bottom. Only it was not mine. I felt my pulse slam in my ears. We traced the transactions together. The account had been opened 2 months before Clara's wedding. Charges ran through catering companies, a luxury floral designer in Lake Forest, a boutique venue in Oak Brook. I recognized every detail because I had seen them splashed across Clara's Instagram feed during her so-called perfect day. And all of it had been billed to me. My chest burned as I gripped the edge of the table. My mother's handwriting on the address portion of the application was clear as day. Clara's emails matched the timing of the withdrawals. I could hear Clara's laugh, sharp and dismissive, when she told friends she had everything under control. Jenna's voice was steady. This is textbook financial fraud. It is not just a family dispute anymore. This is a crime. Thomas shook his head, disgust etched across his face. I told you to keep distance years ago, Elise. They were using you as a safety net, but this is beyond anything I imagined. I pressed my palms flat on the table, trying to keep the rage contained. For years I had excused, explained, convinced myself they needed me. And now here it was in black and white. They had stolen my name, my identity, to buy chandeliers and roses and crystal glasses for a wedding I was not even allowed to attend. Jenna slid a new document toward me, her tone firm. We file with the Illinois State Court. Fraud, identity theft, and damages. You have the evidence. We will let the law do what family would not. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted the pen. I thought of Margaret clutching pearls at Sunday services, of Richard hiding behind silence, of Clara posing in her lace gown under an arch of roses that I had unknowingly paid for. The pen touched paper. My name flowed across the complaint, and with it came something almost like peace. Jenna gathered the papers quickly, efficient as always. I will have this filed within the week, she said. They will be served. The weight in the room shifted. For the first time in months, I felt ground solid beneath me. It was no longer a private wound. It was evidence, testimony, legal action. Thomas closed his folder and gave me a look of quiet approval. You are finally protecting yourself, he said. And believe me, the system takes this seriously. I sat back in my chair, the city hum drifting faintly through the window. A storm was coming, but this time it would not be inside me. That evening, I walked out onto the street, the heat breaking into a faint breeze off the river. Cars streamed past, strangers carried their own burdens, and for once I did not feel small in mine. I carried a file under my arm, and inside it was every betrayal written in ink that could not be denied. I knew what was waiting once the papers landed on their doorstep. The shouting, the denial, the venom. But it no longer mattered. This fight had left the shadows of family secrets. It was stepping into the light of the court. And I was ready. The call came on a gray afternoon, the kind where the clouds pressed low over the river and made the city feel smaller. I did not recognize the number at first, and when I answered, his voice caught me off guard. Mark Dalton. He asked if we could meet, his tone clipped but not hostile, the kind of voice that suggested he had rehearsed the questions several times before dialing. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything. We met at a cafe tucked along the Riverwalk, a place with wide glass windows that looked out over the slow water and the steel bridges arching above. The smell of roasted beans filled the air, and couples murmured around us. Mark sat at a corner table, hands folded tightly around a paper cup he had not touched. He stood when I approached, polite but stiff, as if uncertain whether I would even acknowledge him. I slid into the chair across from him, studying the faint lines around his eyes that looked deeper than they had the night of Clara's wedding. He did not waste time. Elise, I saw the emails. My chest tightened. Which emails? The ones between Clara and your mother. He leaned forward, his voice low. About the credit applications, the way they used your name. $80,000. He shook his head slowly, as if still trying to absorb the number. I should not have seen them, but I did. And now I cannot unsee it. I let out a long breath, the sound almost drowned by the hiss of the espresso machine. So you know. He nodded, his expression heavy. Clara said it was temporary, that you had agreed, that you were fine with it. But then I read her words, the way she planned it, how your mother encouraged it. He looked straight at me, unblinking. That is not temporary. That is theft. For a moment I said nothing, only watched the ripples of light across the river outside. My sister's perfect marriage was cracking barely weeks after the vows. It was not me wielding the hammer. It was her own lies. Mark's voice dropped softer. I married her because I believed in her in the version she showed me. But I do not want to be the kind of man who shuts his eyes to the truth. I have seen what that does. He hesitated, then added, like your father. The words struck harder than I expected. Richard, always silent, always avoiding confrontation, had let rot grow in our family because he would not face it. To hear Mark name, it was like having a mirror held up to a wound I had learned to ignore. I folded my hands around my cup, though it had gone cold. You are realizing it now, but this is who Clara has been for years. The debts, the lies, the way she used me whenever she needed saving. I paused, my voice firmer than I intended. And my parents let her, encouraged her. He pressed his lips together, staring at the table. I kept thinking I could fix it, that love would cover it. But you cannot fix something that is built on fraud. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the clink of dishes and the steady hum of voices around us. I studied him, wondering what it cost him to admit it out loud. Finally, he looked up, his eyes weary. What will you do now? I straightened in my chair. I already filed. It is in court. He exhaled sharply, as if the confirmation both relieved and unsettled him. Clara will hate me for even meeting you. That is between you two, I said. I am not here to pull you to my side. But I will not let what they did disappear quietly. He nodded slowly, his jaw tense. You are right. He rubbed his forehead, and for a moment he looked much older than his 37 years. I do not know where this leaves us, but I cannot be blind to it anymore. The river outside caught a thin shaft of sun breaking through the clouds, a pale streak on the dark water. I followed it with my eyes, feeling the strange weight of this conversation settle inside me. For so long, Clara had played the role of the adored daughter, the successful bride, the one who got away with everything. And now the foundation she had built was showing cracks in front of her own husband. Mark finally pushed back his chair, standing slowly as if reluctant to leave. Thank you for meeting me, Elise. I gave a small nod. I did not thank him back. He walked out into the gray afternoon, shoulders squared but heavy, and I remained at the table, staring at the untouched coffee between my hands. The city moved on outside, indifferent, but I knew something had shifted again. Clara's perfect facade was no longer just crumbling for me. It was crumbling in her own home. And the sound of it was louder than any words I could have spoken. The first article appeared in the Tribune on a cool October morning. The headline was blunt, stripped of all the gloss Clara had spent years layering around herself. Local architect Clara Warren named in credit fraud lawsuit. I sat at my kitchen table in Chicago with the paper spread in front of me, the words stark in black and white. No photo of her smiling at ribbon cuttings, no breathless praise of her designs. Just the fact of it, plain and unavoidable. By noon, the calls had started. Cousin Rebecca texted a screenshot of the article with nothing but 3 dots afterward, as if even she could not find the words. By evening, a colleague from the church choir wrote me saying she was stepping back from Clara's wedding committee, embarrassed to have been associated. The unraveling was happening fast, faster than I had expected. The following week, the fallout deepened. A major interior design firm in Milwaukee that had hired Clara for a multi-million-dollar project announced they were severing ties. Their statement was careful but firm, citing concerns over professional integrity. I knew what that meant. Clients did not want their names tangled with a fraud case, not when reputations were at stake. At church, whispers became open disapproval. Pastor Williams avoided mentioning her name from the pulpit. Families who had once praised my sister's talent now pulled back, leaving her isolated in the very community she had flaunted as her stage. For years she had been the shining daughter, the pride of Richard and Margaret. Now, she was the cautionary tale. I heard from Jenna that Clara's own friends had stopped answering her calls. Even her maid of honor had unfollowed her on social media, a public rejection more brutal than any private words. For the first time, Clara was standing alone, stripped of the safety net of admiration she had always counted on. The weight of it fell hardest on my father. Richard had always chosen silence his way of avoiding conflict, but silence could not hold against headlines. He stopped showing up at his golf club. His neighbors told me he seemed smaller somehow, like a man who had been hollowed out. One afternoon I got a message from an old family friend that he had collapsed at the grocery store. The doctor said it was exhaustion and stress, but I knew better. The strain of years of enabling had finally pressed into his body. My mother reacted differently. Margaret grew sharper, her voice shriller, as if denial could shout down reality. She left angry voicemails on my phone demanding to know how I could humiliate them like this. I did not answer. Jenna had already filed for a restraining order. By November, the judge signed it, granting me 500 feet of distance from all of them. The irony was bitter. For decades, they had told me to stay away, to not ruin their moments. Now the law itself commanded them to keep away from me. The papers were delivered, and with them came a finality I had not expected. For the first time since I was a child, I no longer had to brace myself for them to appear at my door or sit in a pew behind me or send another guilt-laden request. The boundary was no longer invisible. It was written, sealed, enforceable. I drove up to the lake house in Michigan the weekend after the restraining order was approved. The leaves had turned deep red and gold, the kind of colors that seemed almost unreal against the steel blue water. The house stood solid, restored from the years of neglect I had reversed with my own hands and money. Once it had been the symbol of their favoritism, their gatherings without me. Now it was mine entirely and legally. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and fresh paint. My desk was set by the wide window overlooking the lake, scattered with sketches, notes, and the laptop that held every record Jenna had filed. I touched the surface of the wood, remembering the invoices I had covered, the tax receipts I had saved, the endless checks I had written to hold this place together. This house had cost me hundreds of thousands, and for years I had told myself it was sacrifice for family, for legacy. But standing there, that afternoon sunlight cutting across the floor, I knew it was never sacrifice. It was proof. Proof that I had carried them, that without me they would have drowned long ago. I opened the windows and let the sharp autumn air rush in. It smelled of leaves and distant smoke, clean and cold. I stood there, breathing it and feeling the quiet press around me. Not the silence of exclusion, but the silence of freedom. For the first time in my life, the lake house was not a reminder of what had been stolen from me. It was mine, a place no one could take, a space I had remade with my own determination. I looked out at the water, steady and endless, and felt something inside me loosen that had been clenched for years. I was no longer the daughter on the outside. I was no longer the sister covering debts. I was standing in my own place, unshadowed, unclaimed by their demands. And in that moment, with the leaves rustling and the lake stretching out before me, I felt truly free. Summer came back around in Michigan, with the heavy green of trees pressed against the lake and the air warm enough to leave every window open. Inside the house, the walls looked different than they had a year ago. The photographs I had hung were mine, now landscapes from the Upper Peninsula, street shots from Chicago sunsets I had chased with a stubborn patience. The frames that once held family portraits were empty or replaced. I no longer needed to look at faces that had been masks. The calendar pinned near my desk was spare but intentional. Half marathon in June, photography workshop in July, Montana trip in August. No birthdays circled, no anniversaries written in careful ink. It was the first time in my adult life that the year belonged entirely to me. One evening in July, the house filled with voices that lifted, not weighed down. Aunt Maxine came through the door with her usual warmth, carrying a basket of fresh peaches from a farm stand. Jenna arrived with a bottle of Cabernet and her sharp smile that always promised both strategy and comfort. Thomas followed with a small box of pastries from a bakery downtown, his tie loosened, his laughter easy. We ate around the big oak table I had refinished myself, plates stacked with grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, slices of peach pie. As the sun dropped over the water, we raised our glasses. Jenna's voice carried over the clink. 1 year, she said, of boundaries standing. 1 year of you finally choosing yourself. Aunt Maxine reached across the table, squeezing my hand, her eyes damp with pride. Thomas nodded and added, to 1 year down and many more ahead. The sound of our glasses meeting echoed gently in the room, and I felt a deep gratitude settle in me. It was not the loud joy of a wedding reception or the forced smiles of a family dinner. It was steadier grounded, a celebration of survival that had turned into growth. Later that night, when the house was quiet again, I found the envelope waiting on the entry table. My name written in a hand I recognized but had not seen in months. Mark Dalton. I carried it to the desk, sat down, and opened it carefully. The letter was brief. He wrote that he was sorry. Sorry he had not seen sooner. Sorry he had not stopped Clara when he knew something was wrong. Sorry that he had been a man who looked away when truth was inconvenient. He told me I deserved happiness that was not conditional, peace that was not borrowed. He ended with a wish for me to keep building the life I had started. I read it twice, then folded it neatly. It did not sting and it did not heal. It was simply another piece of what had been another echo of a story that was no longer mine to carry. I slipped it into the wooden box I kept in the closet beside the letter my father had sent months earlier. His words had been different, more strained, asking for understanding, but I had placed them in the same box all the same. The box was not heavy. It was small enough to fit on the highest shelf. I closed the lid, turned the key, and walked away. It was not about shutting them out or holding on to bitterness. It was about placing them where they belonged in the past, preserved but powerless. In the mornings, I ran along the shoreline path, training for the half marathon, the rhythm of my feet steady against the gravel. In the afternoons, I set up my camera by the window or drove out into the countryside, chasing light across barns and fields. Some nights I cooked for myself and let the silence wrap around me, a silence that was no longer empty but chosen. One warm evening, as the sun slid low and painted the lake in streaks of gold, I stood by the water with my camera and let the shutter click. The frame caught the horizon, the trees, the quiet curve of the shore. It looked nothing like the photographs of my childhood, crowded with forced smiles and posed gatherings. This was different. This was mine. Healing is a word people use too easily, as if it has one shape, one finish line. Some say it means forgiveness, the act of opening your arms again to those who broke you. I thought about that as the water moved gently against the rocks. For me, healing felt like something else. It felt like choosing peace, not waiting for someone else to hand it to me. It felt like walking forward without looking back to see if they followed. The house behind me was filled with proof of that choice. The friends who showed up and stayed. The photographs that told new stories. The calendar that marked a life I had made on my own terms. I breathed in the summer air, steady and calm, and felt the weight of the past settle where it belonged. Not erased, not forgiven, but no longer sharp. If it were you standing where I stood, would you choose to forgive, or would you choose the quiet of your own peace?